Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you're new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate a small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you could do is to watch this show, like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest tonight, Professor Nicolai Petro. Professor Petro is a professor of political science at the University of Rhode Island. He is known for his work on US-Russia relations, the roots of the Ukraine conflict, and the politics of Eastern Europe. Professor Petro is also a former US State Department Special Assistant on Soviet Affairs. His recent book, The Tragedy of Ukraine, is widely regarded as one of the most important analyses of the civil, cultural, and international dimensions of the war. Professor Petro, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Thank you, Jyotsman.
There have been a series of developments over the conflict in Ukraine. We have seen the 28-point plan proposed by the US, later amended to 20 points as per some reports. We have also a parallel European 28-point plan rejected by the Russians. There is also the Geneva meetings between Ukrainian and US officials, and as per the latest developments, we have the meeting between Russian officials and the American officials in Abu Dhabi. For our viewers, if you can update on these series of developments and what do they mean for the conflict over Ukraine?
Well, it means that there are peace negotiations underway, and this is always a messy product. There's a famous saying attributed to German Chancellor Bismarck in the 19th century that there are two things that people should never be shown. One is how sausages are actually made, and the other is how laws are actually made. I think we can safely add to that list how peace negotiations are actually conducted. And so there's nothing at all unusual to what's happening. It's just part of this messy product, with the things being leaked to selected press outlets are merely part of the negotiation strategy for for the many members involved. And remember, we have four major actors. That's the EU, the United States, Ukraine, and Russia. And within those larger teams, within those larger coalitions, there are sub-actors fighting against each other in each of those four, trying to influence the position both of their own team and of the other teams as well. So it's a very complicated constellation, which we will not be able to make sense of, literally, I think, until the very end, until there is an actual agreement signed. And if it's like many other agreements in the past, not all of it will be made public. I could easily foresee that parts of this agreement, this final agreement or settlement, would be secret and only held and agreed to directly by the parties involved.
And are there any clauses or points within that 28 or 20 points that particularly struck you, or you might think that, well, these couple of clauses might be a problem for one side or another? Can you discuss some of the clauses that might have struck you? Yeah.
So I would start with the positive. And it can be summed up if one looks at the 28-point US plan as leaked and the 28-point counter proposal by the EU as leaked, that between those two plans, we have substantial agreement on 20 of the 28 points. That's so important, I would like to reiterate that. There is substantial agreement on 20 of the 28 points. And I suspect that that is in no small part due to the involvement as a negotiator for Ukraine of Rustem Umerov, who was the former defense minister of Ukraine until April and knows the situation, the dire situation of Ukraine on the front better than most people, and is currently serving as the head of the Ukrainian National Security and Defense Council. So he was heavily involved and added several key points to these negotiations, if one is to believe the Western press accounts. Problems nevertheless exist on points 3, 7, 8, and 26. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into what those are, but they are, I think, overall resolvable problems. In other words, there's a discrepancy in the actual number of troops that Ukraine should have in peacetime. But that difference is apparently getting narrower. And mind you, and this is important, it is not a fundamental disagreement that Ukraine's armed forces should be capped. It is merely, as in the Istanbul Accords in April 2022, it is the figure at which they should be capped that is a point of disagreement. But there are three baskets of major problems that remain. So I'd like to focus attention on those. They are in both agreements, in both proposals, I should say. Point 14, what to do with frozen Russian assets, sovereign assets. Point 20, religious, cultural, and linguistic tolerance for minorities in Ukraine. And point 21, territorial recognition. So what is the basic disagreement on those points? With respect to the frozen Russian assets, the US proposal wants these assets unfrozen and used for the reconstruction and development of both Ukraine, the major part, and about a third of them devoted to improving overall relations between Russia and the United States. So one can envision a variety of scenarios there. The essential point is that the US provides a mechanism for unfreezing and using the assets immediately for Ukrainian reconstruction. The EU does not want that. The EU has proposed that they remain frozen as collateral for Russia's repayments to Ukraine. And they have proposed for a while an illegal, under international law as it currently is understood, an illegal scheme to simply appropriate those assets, take them, seize them, appropriate them, call it what you will, and then oblige Ukraine to repay them if Russia agrees to pay a substantial penalty. It's not clear to whom or to what type of political economic instrument for the reconstruction of Ukraine. So rather than using the money directly with Russia's permission, they are developing a new and heretofore unseen in international financial practice mechanism for using the Russian money, and then arguably they will say it is not being confiscated because it will be repaid, but only if Russia pays an appropriate penalty, equivalent essentially to the amount being seized. So point 20 is another obstacle between the two proposals. The religious, cultural, and linguistic tolerance of minorities in Ukraine. The US wants programs for cultural tolerance to be introduced, as well as mutual understanding between the minority communities and the Ukrainian population and the Ukrainian speaking community. There is also a provision for equal media and educational access to Russian language sources and a prohibition on Nazi ideology. So those are the components of what the United States proposes. The EU does not support any of these with any specifics. The EU instead proposes the general EU rules that already exist on religious and linguistic minorities. Not, by the way, and I thought this was interesting, not minority populations, but specifically only linguistic minorities, because under Ukrainian law, there is no Russian minority at all in Ukraine. There are still Russian speakers. However, a concerted attempt is being made to prohibit the public use of Russian. So the EU does not address any of these religious, cultural, or linguistic concerns of the population in the eastern part of Ukraine that are so important to the Russian side. And the last point, which more attention has been focused on in the West compared to point 20, in which very little attention has been paid to in the Western media. Point 21 is territorial recognition. In effect, the United States wants a land swap. The areas outside of the 5 territories that Russia claims are part of Russia. Russian forces have already gone beyond those borders in several regions of Ukraine. And what the United States proposes is that in exchange for transferring control of about a quarter to a third of the Donetsk region, that Russia pull back from the areas that it has occupied in the rest of Ukraine. And that in the disputed regions of Kherson and Zaporozhye, in the regions not currently controlled by Russia, a demilitarized buffer zone would be created. However, that territory, although being demilitarized, and there would be no Ukrainian troops in that area, and presumably no Russian troops as well, nevertheless, under the US proposal, that territory would be recognized as Russian territory. And there would be a formal recognition of the borders of what Russia currently recognizes or sees as its own territory. By contrast, the EU offers no recognition of the territories under Russian control and proposes instead that we simply begin negotiations over where to draw the territorial border, beginning at the current line of contact. So that would be advantageous to Ukraine in Donetsk and Kherson and Zaporozhye. It would be disadvantageous to Ukraine in Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, and I believe Sumy as well, parts of Sumy, which are under Russian control. So just not settle this issue at all, says the EU, but begin negotiations. So that's the state of play as I understand it currently, ignoring all the rumors that have occurred in the last 24 hours.
And the Western mainstream media, I'm thinking about the New York Times, they are presenting this as an enormous concessions, or in fact, in their terms, it's dictated by the Russians. But the Russian officials seem to be very cautious, and they haven't officially sent any responses yet to the plan. What's your intuition or your thoughts about how would the Russians respond to the 28 or 20 point plan?
It's important to understand that the Russians are not yet involved in the negotiations. Maybe they are behind the scenes, but really what is happening currently is one part of the West is negotiating with another part of the West, basically at the expense of Ukraine. So this is an in-house negotiation of the West trying to come up with something resembling a united front that they could both then impose on Ukraine. At that point, if such a united front is agreed to, then Russia's demands would come into play. And Russia would begin negotiating based on its own interests, making counter proposals to whatever is proposed by the West on Ukraine's behalf. So we probably still have a ways to go, and the interpretation of who is benefiting from this agreement and who is losing more will probably swing and has swung and will continue to swing widely across the political spectrum, depending on who you talk to. There is a cohort in the West who believes that there should be no negotiations and that Ukraine should continue to fight until it is entirely exhausted and most likely defeated. What the West should do is encourage that exhaustion, it seems, because there is no serious proposal in Europe to intervene militarily, to provide sufficient funds to turn the tide, and to make up the manpower that is lacking in Ukraine, or to send its own troops. That is in large part why, as both the United States and Russia has pointed out a number of times, there is no independent, and has never been, a European proposal for peace. All they are doing is egging on Ukraine to fight. And as a result, in one of the early accounts of the negotiations that was published, there was an interesting insight by the people who were involved in the negotiations regarding the attitude of the Ukrainian negotiators to the as yet unleaked proposal, the proposal itself. And it was pointed out that they were becoming increasingly frustrated, specifically with the Europeans, because the Europeans were demanding the world of the Ukrainians in terms of fighting, but not actually offering any meaningful assistance, leaving essentially the Ukrainians to hang out to dry. And as a result, and this is a quote in a piece that Ben Aris wrote in Telenews, he pointed out that one of the Western European observers at this process said it was remarkable to him how well the Ukrainian and the Russian delegates to these to the proposal understood each other, in contrast to the Western Europeans. I've always argued for a number of years that the optimal way to solve this problem would be for Russians and Ukrainian official delegates to sit down and negotiate directly with each other, face to face, and get it settled, and put everyone else out of the room and put before them a fait accompli, which would very much guarantee that it would be a proposal that both Ukraine and Russia could agree to. Because right now we have so many parties involved that the end result, I'm afraid, will be, there's an English saying that too many cooks spoil the broth. And indeed, we may get something like that in the final product, which will then make it something that will not last for very long.
The ABC News on Tuesday has reported that an unnamed U.S. official has said that Ukraine has more or less agreed to the 20 points with quote-unquote minor details. What's your reading about Ukraine accepting the proposal? Does it mean that we are closer to a negotiated settlement out of this conflict? And secondly, what would be its impact on Ukrainian domestic politics?
If that report is true, then I wouldn't be very surprised, because as numerous press reports tell us, Ukrainian officials were involved in the commenting on the draft for 2 weeks at least. It is the Ukrainian media, unofficial media, is reporting that Zelensky saw this draft on the 28th, as soon as it was proposed by the White House. And the Europeans, however, saw it only in early November. And that the German Chancellor's office, contrary to his assertions, received a copy and did not respond, and therefore was repeatedly asked to comment on it, which he did not do, so that when he learned about it, he could say, I had no idea. The obstacle at this point, based on what you just reported, and this seems to be confirmed by the way that the Europeans are approaching this, the obstacle is not the Ukrainians' even acceptance of the proposal made by the United States. It is the Europeans. They are adding a number of caveats which have really nothing to do with Ukraine, either domestically or its foreign policy agenda. It is all about making sure that Europe is involved in the process rather than removed from the process. And I'm not sure the interests of peace, that it is in the interests, well, let me put it this way. It would be in the interest of peace to have Europe involved in the process. And Russia recognizes this, according to, again, a report in Telenews, and wanted the Germans to be part of the process. But the current political elite in Germany again, the current political leadership in Germany is consumed by hostility toward Russia. And this makes it very difficult for them to accept a proposal which minimizes the role of Europe and allows peace to be established without European supervision over the process. That's one aspect of it. But there is another aspect that is also very important to Russia, and this comes up often in the US proposal, which is that Russia has for years, since at least 2008, fielded a number of proposals for a general, or I would say pan-European peace treaty with Europe, because they understand that Europe is the political and military force egging on Ukraine and seeking to transform Ukraine into a military bulwark against Russia, partly so that Europe does not have to spend as much money or not put its own troops on the front lines in the case of a conflict with Russia. Much of that military conflict would be absorbed and take place not in Europe proper, but in the Slavic lands, Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. Domestically speaking, we don't know. It's very difficult to say what the response will be. There have been a lot of leaks that are targeted to affect and influence the thinking of key political and financial figures in Ukraine. But because the official state media has virtually total control, there is still one media outlet, one television channel called the United Marathon, which presents only the government's point of view. And the only other thing we have to go on are channels which are under surveillance and pressure by the government, and therefore exist in other areas, are broadcasting and putting discussions with sometimes with Ukrainian officials, as well as a variety of other commentators on YouTube, and they get a lot of views. They're an alternative source of information from the EU, from the Baltic states, from Russia, from Belarus, sometimes also within Ukraine. But these sources contrast sharply in their attitudes from the government. So we cannot really say what the attitude of the populace will be. This reminds me of one other point of disagreement between the two plans, the EU plan and the US plan. The US plan stipulates, in conformity with the Ukrainian constitution, that once the ceasefire, once a peace treaty is declared, that martial law ends. Once martial law ends, they're given the fact that the term limit for Zelensky's presidency has expired, emergency elections have to be called within 100 days. So this is simplified in the US plan to say, once the treaty is signed, Ukraine will hold elections in 100 days. Those will be presumably for the presidency and for the unicameral parliament, the Rada. The EU plan says nothing about this. But in fact, if the constitution were to be followed, and as Zelensky has said last year, I believe, the constitution of Ukraine is currently on pause, as he puts it. If the constitution were to regain force, again, there would have to be new elections. And at that point, well, there are a variety of scenarios that could play out, which are now all simply very highly speculative.
And how important is the EU, given the EU seems to be the biggest impediment to the way forward? Of course, Macron has said that they have no intention to let the stolen Russian assets be used in any other way than Europeans deciding unilaterally on it. Chancellor Merz has said that this proposal presents no, as he quotes it, an enforceable way to deter the Russians. And Macron has also said that they don't intend to limit the Ukrainian army. All of this seems to suggest that they have no intention of a genuine way forward. But how important are they if the Ukrainians, Russians, and the Americans decide to push forward as a negotiated settlement out of this conflict?
It would suffice, as I've indicated here and elsewhere, it would suffice for Ukrainians and Russians to sit down and negotiate between themselves. That would end the conflict, period. The EU is the spoiler at this point. And Macron, if he says that there is no intention of limiting the numbers of the Ukrainian armed forces, cap the size of the Ukrainian armed forces, he has not read his own proposal, because it does name a specific figure. It says 800,000, whereas the US proposal was 600,000. So he's already, shall we say, dissembling with respect to what he thinks or what is in the treaty. The US is trying to act as an arbiter, but as a number of commentators in Ukraine and Russia have pointed out, it is at this point very difficult to take the United States seriously as an honest peace broker, because the events that led up to the war, and this is the standard Russian view, the events that led up to the war and that led to the failure of the Istanbul agreement in April 2022, which would have ended the war back then. The very architect of this policy was the United States. So any party to this agreement has to ask themselves, how reliable are the commitments that the United States undertakes in this agreement? The Economist magazine in Britain had an op-ed, an editorial piece this week, or maybe the end of last week, in which they bluntly stated that the United States is unreliable, that it has no intention of ever specifically fighting, if necessary, Russia over Ukraine. And as a result, whatever commitments are in that it suggests it is making cannot be trusted. So Europe is carving out, I think, for itself a very difficult future between a Russia that it has declared an enemy, an America that it does not trust, and a Ukraine that does not necessarily trust that Europe has its best interests at heart.
And what would be the future of NATO? And I'm asking this because one aspect of NATO is its aggressive component against Russia. Then there is a global component of NATO, even if NATO is named as North Atlantic, but we all know that there is a global component to that US military enterprise. Given this defeat in Eurasia, what does it mean for the US empire or the Western empire in the context of an overall decline of the West? And I'm adding the US defeat in the economic warfare that it imposed on China and much of the rest of the world, the whole expose of its genocidal campaign in Palestine, overall economic stagnancy in the West. I mean, we can go on and on, but if you could place the larger implication of this on the Western Empire.
So NATO um, was set up, as its first Secretary General put it, to keep the Americans in Europe, the Germans down, and the Russians out. That's a rather famous saying from the early days, when NATO was set up. Today, it is the United States that no longer sees NATO as fulfilling necessarily its global objectives. Therefore, I think that has been the main reason why, for a number of presidencies already, not just under Trump, but even his predecessors, there has been a clearer and clearer strategy by the United States to create a sense of distance between American global strategic objectives and the military resources that America needs to provide for itself to obtain those obtain those objectives. And NATO, which, given the complexity of the decision making, given that so many of its richest members have been reluctant to shift resources for decades away from social expenditures toward military expenditures, have proven to be unreliable. And push came to shove, specifically with the war in Iraq, which was, for the United States at the time, as Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld points out, the litmus test of loyalty to the United States. And Europe, the major European powers, Britain, France, and Germany, from America's eyes, failed the Iraqi loyalty test because they did not support the war in Iraq. And as a result, America decided on a very different strategy, namely to move away from its reliance on the Western European core of NATO and to build what Rumsfeld called the new Europe, and to build stronger relationships with those European countries formerly in the Warsaw Pact, to bring them into NATO and to make sure that they were beholden to the United States and they could be seen as more reliable and friendly to the United States. So this rift has never truly healed between the United States and Europe. And I think we are also likely to see it reemerge within Europe itself, within NATO itself, because the easternmost flank of NATO in this conflict, and I presume for the foreseeable future, will remain more bellicose, more willing to spend money of the alliance, but and the reluctance to do so will continue to be from the wealthier Western European countries, which are more concerned, frankly, with their social welfare problems than they are with military security of Eastern Europe. And the examples given by currently Hungary, Slovakia, and to a lesser extent, countries and leaders in countries like Ireland, Malta, Bulgaria, taking a stance, sometimes even Croatia, countries where leaders are clear that they oppose territorial annexation that Russia and the aggression that Russia has committed in Ukraine. They oppose that, but they are also opposed to any steps that lead to an escalation of the conflict and potentially war with Russia. So that is a paralyzing difficulty for NATO that is I can't see how it will be resolved. And one of the solutions that Russia is proposing to Europe's own dilemma in this respect is it's not a new solution, but it's one that they keep bringing up. They point out that NATO is a product and remains a product to this day of the Cold War. If we want stability, peace, and security within Europe, it should be under the auspices of a new organization that takes the interest of the entire continent, which of course would include Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and all the republics of the former Soviet Union, west of the Urals at least, into account, and begin sort of from scratch in what might be called a new Helsinki process. This comes through very clearly in the initial points made by the US plan that presumably, or it would appear, the United States endorses.
We have 2 minutes. I know you need to go, but let's see if we can pull out a real quick
I'll try to be brief.
questions. Okay. Yeah, given what you said that the US is not an honest broker, there are not yet direct substantive talks between Ukraine and Russia, and given the EU continues to be an impediment, so that's one side of it. The other side is, of course, there seems to be a rush within the US administration to at least come up with a show deal. What is your sense of whether this proposal would be a step forward to these larger Helsinki processes you have just outlined for a more substantive peace process? Do you think this can be a stepping stone to that larger process?
With respect to the time deadline set, this is a common technique, namely to put the counterparty under a time constraint if one is trying to avoid them using other resources and rallying resources in their favor. This is specifically a technique that the Trump administration, but not only the Trump administration, has used in the past in order to obtain some result, not necessarily the optimal result, but some result. And it makes a lot of sense in the context of the way that Ukraine has treated these negotiations with Russia since 2014, so for 10 years. And that includes Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 and Istanbul and all of the entire, the rest of the negotiating process. What has happened in the past is that once a proposal is made, Zelensky takes time, gets European support to make changes, then comes back with an alternative proposal that is then forwarded to the Russians, who find it unacceptable, and the whole process starts over. We never reach an agreement that way because that is what the strategy of seeking more time is aimed at preventing a settlement, a negotiated settlement. The only reason we got a Minsk 2 accord, by the way, is also because the principals sat down and negotiated directly for 48 hours and decided that they had to get an agreement in that time frame. So I think if the time limit is adhered to, some sort of agreement is likely to emerge. Any agreement at this point is a step forward, not because it will be acceptable to the Russians. Remember, as I said, it is only the proposals of one side now finally consolidated, namely the EU and the US, imposing their desires on Ukraine. So, but having that is the basis for movement forward to the next stage. Again, Russia will have to come back to that agreement and see what parts of it are acceptable and can be renegotiated. But the positive aspect of having at least some document come out of the current process in Geneva is that it will be something on paper that establishes a foundation for where to go in the future. After all, as has been noted, this particular agreement that is currently being negotiated in Geneva is not coming out of nowhere. It is actually based on several of the points already made in the Istanbul Accords in 2022, and it has been aptly referred to as Istanbul Plus. I suppose the next step would be Istanbul Plus Plus, and so on until a final negotiated settlement is reached.
We'll leave it there, Professor Petro. Thank you so much for your time, and this was a very insightful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have 2 requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.